Now, as we look at this, I want to turn to Luke, and that's where we'll be for the main text. Luke is the gospel that was written by Luke, and he goes around and he interviews people who saw this firsthand, and he writes this as a historian would write a historical narrative or bibliography, a biography, and he writes that, and he gives us verified facts of Jesus' life and birth. And we have here the introduction that Jesus is alive. Now, what we see is that a lot of what Luke tells us was foretold in the Old Testament. And as we mentioned last week, there was a time period in which the last prophet of God, Malachi, spoke, and then there were 400 years of silence, 400 years in which the presence of God was not here, and people had become frustrated. Some had forgotten, and some had started to give their own ideas of what they were supposed to do while they were waiting. If you have your sermon notes, you'll see a couple scriptures there. The first is Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. And when we have that scripture, it tells us something that seems crazy. It says, "Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. See, the virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel," which is God with us. You maybe have sung that song. Maybe you've been in church before. And so many times we read that and we think that and we go, oh yeah, that's how it's supposed to happen. But I don't know about you, but that idea of a virgin giving birth is crazy. How many virgins do you know that give birth on a regular basis? It's improbable. It doesn't make any sense. It's just like, what's that guy from Princess Bride that says that crazy thing? It's inconceivable, right? You know, this idea, this concept, this thing, it doesn't make sense. And if you go even further into this, Isaiah 9:6, we see another prophecy from Isaiah declaring about the Messiah. It says, "For a child will be born for us, a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace." Declaring that this virgin birth will yield forth a son, and he will be awesome. But there was a time in which God declared that for his plan to be worked out, that he had to send his son to this earth. And this couldn't just be some God coming to this earth to rule and to reign and destroy everything and to lead with an iron fist and to come up. Instead, he said that there needs to be this sacrificial lamb to come and to make things right. And God decided, instead of working on the outside of humanity, to actually work through humanity to bring about his will, which has been God's plan from the very beginning and will be to the very end. Humanity, God's chosen chief creation, is part of what God's doing to restore and bring about his deliverance. And God decided to do something which seems so odd and so unbelievable. He actually allowed for his Spirit to rest on a chosen vessel, which was Mary, whom we know as the mother of Jesus. And she was supposed to have a baby, and would have a baby, and will have a baby that would be the Son of God here on this earth. This is crazy. And that's really the first thing I want you to grab, because I think sometimes, especially in our culture, we hear this all the time and we just take it for granted. But this is huge. This is an impossibility. And in fact, maybe that's your struggle with faith, right? There's so many things that are impossible, and there's so many things that I have to believe in that I can't see with my hands, that I can't touch and taste, and my senses don't make sense, and so I just choose not to believe. But that is the essence of faith. Or on the other side, right, you become a faithful person. You say, I can believe in the Bible, I can believe in Jesus, but then when it comes down to it, the things that you know you need God to do in your life, you won't really believe that he can do it because it just seems impossible. Today, I want you to walk away with this idea that the impossible in our lives because of the work of God is a probable thing. I mean, what would it take for you in your life, and what would it take for me in my life? What would it take for me to believe that the impossible was a reality? What do I have to do to position myself? What do you have to do to position yourself in your mind? What do you have to do when this word came to Isaiah and he spoke it to a people who needed to hear it, and he spoke it to at a time when there was a need for a king and they were looking for a king. He says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. See, the virgin will conceive and have a son and name him Emmanuel. They needed God to move. They wanted God to move. They needed this sign, and God said, here's the sign. Here's what's going to happen. And then sometime later, if you're reading Isaiah, you'll read through, eventually there is a child that's born, and it's born to this woman. Then the angel said, do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. Now listen, verse 31, you will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. What are you thinking at that point? Angel comes to you, says, hey, this is what it's going to be. You're thinking, what? No way. This is not going to happen. This is impossible. Impossible. Maybe that's been your own area. God's encouraged you to do something. You keep giving that in your spirit. Look, I want to do this, and I feel like God's called me to do this, but it's impossible. So you just squish it down further, or you just reject it, or you just go, I don't know. Or maybe you just get frustrated because that impossible thing that you believe God's going to make possible, it's just not happening. And so you're frustrated, and you just want to give up, and you're no longer believing. This is what Mary says. Mary asked the angel, how can this be since I have not had sexual relations with a man? So that tells us Mary's smart. She knows how babies are made, right? And it's a reason why this is impossible. But here's what's interesting. When we are people of faith, at the essence of what faith is that I believe in the impossible. That's what faith is. Faith at its very core is a belief in things unseen. It's this idea that I struggle and I don't, but there's so much in our culture and so much around us and so much in our science and our intelligence that says, don't believe it if you can't see it. You know what? You don't believe how space is. We're going to shoot a rocket up and we're going to send it out and we're going to look at these galaxies. You don't believe it until you see it, and people are like, "Oh my goodness!" We're going to send a thing around the Earth so you can see it go around, so you can believe that the Earth is made this way, or that things are this way. We're going to do that so you can see it, right? And then there's even some of us are just like, I don't know, that's not true, right? I just don't believe it. But for believers, Christians, if you are a Christian, at the very essence of who we are, we believe the impossible. And that's why I want you to grab today that being a believer in God, believing in Jesus Christ automatically means that the impossible is probable. That has to be our stance. That has to be the way that we look in life, that constantly. So here you are, and you're in your position, and you're in your job, or you're in your relationship, and you're in your school, and you're thinking, this is an impossible task. If you are a Christian, impossible is not our word. when we align ourselves with the will of God, we have to at least shift from impossible to probable. And that's what I want you to think about today. What if all of the things in your life that you feel like God is calling you to, you feel like God is doing in your life, those big faith jumps, what if you said instead of impossible, you put the word probable? This probably can happen. I mean, that's like a step of faith, right? Like probably. At least there's some real expression of doubt, and there's some real expression of faith in that statement. Mary needs to know that. First time I saw power in this church was almost 20 years ago, and I had been with some of our oldest adult ladies, and many of them had lost children. They had miscarriage after miscarriage, and some of them had gone on to, because they couldn't have children, to adopt. And I started hearing all these stories, and I was like, oh my goodness. And I realized there was a whole group of families that had come through our church that never shared this testimony. And here I am now as a young pastor, and I'm sitting with people that are my own age, and I'm hearing these same stories of how they're miscarriage after miscarriage, and they can't have kids, and they don't know what they're going to do. And in my mind, I thought, you know what? You know what we need? We need this group of ladies who have seen God even in their barrenness and their struggle. We need them to get together with these girls and these young men and talk about it and figure it out. And the first time I think I ever really mourned the work of this church is when those women who had been through this, who were declaring that God had alleviated their burden and had seen, they said they would not be willing to share. They were only willing to share with me. And I was burdened by that. And I mourned that. And seriously, I mourned it. You know why I mourned it? Because here I am going to places and homes and praying with these young couples and seeing the pain that they're in and hearing those struggles. And then I'm going over to these people who are now in their 80s and 90s, and they had gone through that, and they had seen that, and they had heard it. Yet they had grown in confidence with God because God did things for them that they never saw as possible. And I saw this great divide of people that needed to hear the testimony of God. They needed to be reminded that God has done some great things with those exact same situations. And they had a group of people over here that were scared and nervous and uncertain. And a culture had told them not to talk about those things, and it had been beaten into them that those were secret and those were bad things. And they were scared to share. And I saw this great divide that I believe that God meant to fill by bringing those groups together. Over the years, there's been a few that have been willing to do that, but it burdened me. And so I started deciding to share what I'm sharing with you. Church, your story matters. What God has done in your life and the littlest tiny things, when you share what God has done, it motivates the rest of us to realize that God will do it again. But when you are silent, when you hold it in, when you take all that, you don't help the church at all. In fact, what you do is you squish the power of God and you create a gap that seems impossible. So don't be afraid to get in community. Don't be afraid to interact with people that don't look like you and don't think like you. Get in those communities and share the work of God. And those of you who are younger, or those of you who are just starting on your journey, no matter your age, and you're scared to say what you believe God's saying, that it seems impossible, you throw that out. Let it come out your mouth. Let it come into your prayers. Let it be a matter of group, because here's what God's going to do, and I know it. When God stirs the heart of people to do something great for Him, and we can hear and be reminded of the stories that God is doing again and again and again, it motivates us to do what God can do. And it takes away that impossibility. And it helps me to rest on the probability. And it helps me to be obedient. It helps you to be obedient. Nothing will be impossible with God. And you see what the response is by Mary. In verse 38, she goes, "See, I am the Lord's servant," said Mary. "May it happen to me as you have said." Then the angel left her. The confidence of the testimony does not take away the need for faith. Mary still has to have faith here. She still has to believe that the impossible is probable. She still has to have that. And it's not going to take it away from you either. Because following God, doing what God says, is always about obedience and always about faith. A faith obedience, a connection in which we have to jump. And so church, I want to ask you, I want to know, do you believe that God can do the impossible? Do you really believe that God can do the impossible? If you really believe it, it's not just some t-shirt, it's not just some social media post, it's not just something, it's not just something you're putting up there. You really believe it. And so how will you use your resources? How will you use your time? How will you use your energy? How will you share your story? How will you move from just touting words and posts and making it that God can do the impossible? How will you this season stretch and take a step of faith, believing that if God did it, he will do it again, and believing that we have a probable God, not an impossible God. This is a faith that we have a God who can do it. How will you, like Mary, take a step of faith and try it?